President Donald Trump was known for his bold and unconventional leadership, often making decisions that surprised both supporters and critics alike. However, the day he received a handwritten letter from a small-town farmer, John Mitchell, was different. The letter was not from a politician, a corporate executive, or a foreign leader, but from a struggling farmer who had spent his entire life working the land passed down through generations. John Mitchell, a proud third-generation farmer, had watched helplessly as his livelihood slipped away due to plummeting crop prices, rising fuel costs, and the growing dominance of massive agricultural corporations. He had written countless letters to lawmakers before, but this time he decided to address the most powerful man in the country directly. He never truly expected a response, let alone a visit. To his surprise, instead of dismissing the letter or sending a generic reply, Trump did something completely unexpected. He accepted the invitation. The news of the president's upcoming visit spread quickly, leaving John and his wife Lisa both anxious and hopeful. For years, farmers like John had felt ignored, drowned out by corporate interests and political rhetoric that rarely translated into meaningful change. This visit felt like a rare opportunity, a chance to make their voices heard, but John was not planning to sugarcoat anything. He was determined to be direct, to speak the unfiltered truth about the hardships farmers face daily. Meanwhile, the White House prepared for the visit with precision. The Secret Service scouted the farm, mapping out security measures, ensuring every possible risk was accounted for. Advisors cautioned Trump about the unpredictability of the conversation he was about to have, but Trump, known for his confidence in handling tough discussions, seemed unfazed. As the presidential convoy rolled into the Mitchell farm, a mix of emotions swirled in John's mind: pride, nervousness, and determination. Standing outside his worn-down farmhouse, he wiped his hands on his overalls, steeling himself for what he knew would be a defining moment. When Trump stepped out of his vehicle, John didn't hesitate. He extended his hand firmly and met the president's gaze. "Mr. President, I appreciate you coming, but I won't sugarcoat my words," he said, setting the tone for what was to come. Trump smirked, seemingly unfazed. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he replied. In that moment, John knew this wasn't going to be a scripted photo opportunity. It was a real conversation, one that could either be another empty exchange or the beginning of something meaningful. As the two men stood in the vast expanse of farmland, surrounded by soil that had been worked for generations, John hoped that for once a politician would truly listen. Little did he know, this visit would set off a chain of events that would not only impact his life, but also change the course of farming policies in America. As John Mitchell stood face to face with President Donald Trump, he wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. Years of frustration and hardship had built up, and now he had the opportunity to lay it all out directly to the most powerful man in the country. "Politicians make big promises, but farmers are drowning," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of countless struggling families. "Prices drop, fuel costs rise, and big corporations keep pushing us out. Are you here to listen or just to talk?" Trump raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by John's straightforwardness. "John, I respect farmers, but things take time," he replied, crossing his arms. But John was not in the mood for diplomatic reassurances. He let out a short scoff. "We don't have time," he countered. "Our land is suffering, families are breaking under debt, and corporations are buying out small farms while we watch everything our ancestors built disappear." The air grew thick with tension. The Secret Service agent standing nearby shifted uneasily, sensing that this conversation was unlike the usual political exchanges they were used to. There was no scripted speech, no rehearsed handshakes, just raw frustration and an unfiltered demand for answers. Trump, a businessman at heart, was no stranger to tough negotiations, but he seemed to realize that this was different. This was not a boardroom or a campaign rally. This was the home of a hard-working American who had nothing to lose by speaking his mind. Lisa, sensing the rising tension, stepped in to ease the atmosphere. "Gentlemen, let's sit down," she suggested, leading them into the house. Inside their modest kitchen, John pointed to the refrigerator. "Mr. President, we grow food for thousands, but we can barely afford our own groceries," he said, his frustration turning to exhaustion. Trump frowned, glancing around at the home's simple furnishings, the worn-out chairs, the crack in the wall that had probably been there for years. ignored because fixing it was less important than keeping the farm running. "What's stopping you from succeeding?" he finally asked. John leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "Big corporations," he said firmly. "They buy up land, drive down prices, and push us out. We can't compete." Trump tapped his fingers against the table. "That's capitalism," he remarked, but John clenched his jaw. "There's a difference between competition and being crushed," he shot back. Lisa placed a plate of homemade cornbread in front of Trump, breaking the moment of silence. "Mr. President, you should taste what struggling America really is," she said softly. Trump picked up a piece and chewed thoughtfully. "It's good," he admitted. Lisa smiled sadly. "We sell this at the market, but we barely make enough." John sighed, his voice carrying the exhaustion of years of struggle. "Farming isn't just a job, Mr. President. It's our life. Our kids should inherit this land, not debt." Trump studied him carefully. "I hear you," he said. But John wasn't convinced yet. "But do you understand us?" he asked, making sure that this conversation wasn't just another political formality. For the first time, Trump looked around not as a leader, but as a man who was beginning to see the human side of policy. Trump sat at the worn wooden kitchen table, chewing the piece of cornbread Lisa had placed in front of him, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something more reflective. The food was simple but rich in flavor, a stark contrast to the carefully curated meals served at the White House. As he swallowed, he glanced around the small home, family photos lining the walls, a scuffed dining table, a faded rug that had seen better days. This wasn't just a house. It was a home built on generations of labor, sacrifice, and love. For a moment, he wasn't sitting as the President of the United States, but as a man in the heart of America, witnessing firsthand the struggle of the very people who fed the nation. John leaned forward, his calloused hands resting on the table. "You say you hear us, Mr. President," he said, his voice firm but not hostile. "But do you really understand what's happening to people like me?" Trump met his gaze, and for once, he didn't have a quick response. Instead, he listened as John continued. "We don't just wake up, work the fields, and go to bed. This land isn't just a business, it's our history, our identity. I was raised here just like my father and his father before him, but now hard work isn't enough anymore. No matter how much effort we put in, the system is stacked against us." Lisa, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. "We work every day to produce food that feeds thousands, but at the end of the day, we struggle to put food on our own table." Her voice was steady, but there was a sadness beneath it that couldn't be ignored. Trump frowned, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "What's stopping you?" he asked, though he already had an idea of the answer. John exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Big corporations," he said, his frustration clear. "They buy up farmland, lower prices to levels we can't compete with, and squeeze us out. We're not looking for handouts, Mr. President. We just want a fair shot. But right now, the banks see us as risks, while corporations get government bailouts. How are we supposed to survive in a system like that?" Trump crossed his arms, his mind working through what John was saying. "I believe in free markets," he said, but John immediately shook his head. "Markets should be fair, not rigged," he countered. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Trump looked over at Lisa, who had begun clearing the plates. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, the quiet resilience of a woman who had spent years supporting her husband through hardship. Then he looked at John again, at his hands, cracked, dirt-stained, the hands of a man who had worked the land since childhood. Something about the sight struck a nerve. He wasn't speaking to lobbyists, economists, or politicians. He was speaking to real Americans, the people who kept the country running, yet were often overlooked in policy decisions. John must have sensed the shift in Trump's demeanor because he stood up and gestured for him to follow. "Come outside, Mr. President," he said. Trump followed him out to the fields, the golden crops stretching endlessly before them. John held up his hands, letting the sunlight highlight the deep lines and rough skin. "These hands have worked this soil since I was a boy," he said. "My father's hands look the same, his father's too. But it's not just about hard work anymore. We can't do this alone." Trump studied him carefully, then looked out at the fields, taking in the sheer vastness of the land, the weight of responsibility that came with it. "So what do you want from me?" he finally asked. John didn't hesitate. "Not handouts, not speeches. We need real change, policies that don't just favor corporations but protect the small farmers, the ones who built this country." Trump was quiet, his usual bravado momentarily absent. Something about this conversation had shifted his perspective. He had come here expecting a simple discussion, maybe even a debate. But what he had found was something far more personal. The struggles of these farmers weren't just statistics or economic talking points. They were real, human, and deeply ingrained in the fabric of America. He turned back to John, his expression more serious than before. "I get it," he said, and for the first time, John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he really did. As Trump left John Mitchell's farm that evening, he couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. The words, the frustration, the deep-rooted struggles that John and Lisa had shared, it all stayed with him long after he had stepped back into his presidential motorcade. Unlike the countless political meetings he had attended, where facts and figures were thrown around without emotion, this was different. This wasn't about numbers on a chart or policy debates in Washington. This was about people, about families who had worked tirelessly for generations only to watch their way of life disappear. That night, back in the White House, Trump sat with his advisors, replaying the conversation in his head. He knew that action was needed, but politics was never simple. There were corporate lobbyists, trade agreements, and a system deeply entrenched in bureaucracy. Still, Trump prided himself on being a deal maker, a man who got things done. He wasn't interested in empty speeches or symbolic gestures. He wanted results. 2 weeks after his visit, while John was out fixing a fence on his land, his phone rang. Wiping sweat from his brow, he picked up without thinking much of it, assuming it was another bill collector or a neighboring farmer. But the voice on the other end made him freeze. "John, it's Donald Trump." The familiarity in the president's tone stunned him. For a moment, John thought it had to be a prank, but there was no mistaking that voice. "Mr. President?" he asked in disbelief. Trump didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I didn't forget our conversation. I've got something in motion," he said firmly. John gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" Trump paused for just a second before replying. "You'll see soon enough," and then the line went dead. John stood there, staring at his phone, unsure of what to make of it. Politicians had made promises before, but they rarely followed through. As much as he wanted to believe Trump, he remained skeptical. A month later, while driving his truck, John turned on the radio and nearly slammed on the brakes when he heard the news. "Breaking news. President Trump has just signed an executive order aimed at protecting small farmers from unfair corporate practices." The word sent a shockwave through him. He pulled over, listening in disbelief as the reporter detailed the provisions of the order. Protections against corporate land takeovers, reforms in farming subsidies to favor small farms, and new measures to ensure fair pricing for crops. Lisa came running out of the house, waving her arms. "John, did you hear?" He jumped out of his truck, his heart pounding. He actually did something. Across the country, farmers who had long felt ignored watched in awe. They had heard promises before, but this was action. Calls flooded in from farmers everywhere. "John, you actually got him to listen." John didn't know what to say. He had never set out to be the voice of a movement, but somehow his frustration had turned into something bigger. For the first time in a long time, small farmers felt seen, and it had all started with a simple letter. A letter that Donald Trump had not only read, but acted upon. John Mitchell had barely begun to process the fact that President Trump had actually taken action when, one afternoon, a black SUV rolled onto his farm once again. The sight of the vehicle alone sent a wave of disbelief through him. A Secret Service agent stepped out, scanning the property before approaching. "Mr. Mitchell, the president wants to see you." John wiped his hands on his jeans, still covered in dirt from a long day's work, and exchanged a quick glance with Lisa, who stood on the porch, just as stunned. Before he could fully gather his thoughts, the car door opened, and there he was, President Trump, stepping onto John's land once again. Unlike his first visit, this time there was no uncertainty, no hesitation. He extended his hand with a knowing smirk. "Told you I wouldn't forget," he said. John shook his head in disbelief before grasping Trump's hand. "I'll admit, Mr. President, I'm impressed," Trump nodded. "I don't just talk, I deliver." Lisa welcomed them inside, still in awe that the President of the United States had returned to their humble home not for a press conference, not for a photo op, but to listen. "So what brings you back, Mr. President?" she asked, setting a fresh plate of cornbread on the table. Trump leaned forward, his expression serious. "I want to hear more. There's still work to do." John studied him carefully, searching for any sign of empty words, but he found none. This wasn't a man looking for applause or political gain. This was a leader determined to finish what he had started. They walked the fields together, the golden crops swaying under the afternoon sun. "What else do farmers need?" Trump asked. John didn't hesitate. "Infrastructure, roads, irrigation, better equipment, better access to markets." Trump nodded, taking in every word. "All right," he said. "Let's make it happen." John squinted at him. "You're serious?" Trump smirked. "You should know by now. I don't joke about winning." John chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a one-time victory. Maybe farmers were finally being heard, and the tides were truly turning. As news of President Trump's actions spread across the country, something unexpected began to happen. Farmers who had long felt abandoned by the system started to believe that real change was possible. Calls poured in from small farm owners, trade groups, and agricultural workers, all wanting to understand what had led to this shift. John Mitchell, who had spent his entire life working the land with little recognition, suddenly found himself at the center of a national conversation. Farmers from across the country reached out, some congratulating him, others asking how he had managed to get the president to listen when so many before him had failed. "I just spoke the truth," John told them, but deep down he knew it was more than that. It was the right moment, the right words, and a leader who, against all odds, had chosen to listen and act. Yet, as much as the executive order brought hope, John knew it wasn't enough. The fight wasn't over. He spent his nights poring over news reports, researching policies, and speaking to other farmers who were still struggling. Despite the progress made, there were still larger battles ahead. Corporations would fight back, banks would still view small farms as high risk, and policy changes could easily be reversed by future administrations. The movement that had started with a simple letter now had momentum, but John knew it needed direction. Then, one evening, as John was sitting at his kitchen table, reviewing new farming policies, his phone rang again. He almost expected it to be another farmer calling to thank him, but when he picked up, the familiar voice on the other end took him by surprise. "John, I want you on an advisory board," Trump said without preamble. John sat back in his chair, stunned. "Me?" he asked, almost laughing at the idea. He was a farmer, not a politician. "Who better to represent real farmers?" Trump responded. John hesitated, glancing at Lisa, who had been listening from across the room. She gave him an encouraging nod, understanding that this was bigger than just their family farm now. John took a deep breath. "I'm not a politician," he said finally. Trump chuckled. Exactly. That was how, weeks later, John found himself stepping into the White House, a place that once felt worlds away from the fields he had worked his entire life. Sitting in a room full of policymakers and economic advisors, he knew he didn't belong in the traditional sense. He wasn't an expert in trade negotiations or federal regulations. But he was an expert in what mattered, what it took to survive as a small farmer in modern America. As Trump turned to him and said, "Tell them what farmers really need," John realized that for the first time in his life, his voice truly mattered. He cleared his throat, looked around the room filled with decision-makers, and said, "All right, let's get to work." Months passed, and John Mitchell found himself balancing two worlds, the relentless demands of running his farm and the unexpected responsibility of being a voice for small farmers nationwide. What had started as a simple letter had turned into something far greater than he ever imagined. He wasn't seeking fame, and he certainly hadn't planned on stepping into the world of politics, but as he sat in policy meetings and spoke with government officials, he realized that if his voice could make a difference, he had a duty to keep speaking. The changes that had begun with President Trump's executive order were real, but John knew that lasting change required continuous effort. Farmers across the country started organizing, advocating for stronger protections and policies that would ensure they could compete in a market dominated by corporations. For the first time in decades, it felt like small farmers had a seat at the table. News outlets continued to cover his story, and while critics called it a publicity stunt, John disagreed. He had sat across from the president, challenged him, and seen firsthand that Trump had chosen to listen when no one else had. That, to John, meant more than any political debate. One evening, as he watched his children run through the fields, he turned to Lisa with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think any of this will really last?" he asked. She smiled. "It already has, John. You got the most powerful man in the country to listen. That's not something that happens every day." John exhaled, staring at the land that had been in his family for generations. He had fought so hard to protect it, and now, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to before. Hope. His phone buzzed again, another farmer reaching out, another conversation to be had. He picked it up, knowing the fight wasn't over, but also knowing that he was no longer fighting alone. If one letter could spark a movement, then maybe, just maybe, real change had only just begun. The meeting between John Mitchell and President Donald Trump is more than just a story about a farmer fighting for his rights. It carries deep lessons that can be applied to life, especially for older audiences who have experienced the ups and downs of life. First, this story reminds us of the power of an individual's voice. No matter who we are or where we come from, we have the right to speak up for what is right. John was just an ordinary farmer, but he refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. He wrote a letter, and that single act sparked a significant change. This teaches us that, no matter how small we may feel, each of us can make a difference if we have the courage to speak out. Second, the story is a testament to the value of truly listening. When Trump stepped onto John's farm, he didn't just hear words, he felt the struggles, the sacrifices, and the pain of farmers. In life, especially as we grow older, we long for the younger generations to truly listen and appreciate the wisdom and experiences we have to share. Real understanding and progress come only when people take the time to listen with open hearts. Lastly, the most important lesson is perseverance and faith in change. Despite the hardships, John never gave up. He believed that if he tried hard enough, things could change. No matter our age, we can embrace this mindset, holding on to hope, staying determined, and continuing to fight for the things that matter, because in the end, change often begins with those who refuse to give up.